Hi, thanks for joining us today to talk about flipping the corporate classroom with Insight Digital Innovation. I'm Jill Blasey-Ciociola, a senior performance consultant, and with me today is the amazing Michele Snead, Director of Performance Consulting. Hi, Michele. Thanks for spending some time today talking about flipping the corporate classroom.
Hey, Jill. It's nice to be with everybody today, and certainly flipping the corporate classroom is something that we could probably talk about all day, but we'll try to keep it to 30, 45 minutes to make sure that we're not boring the audience. But it's certainly an exciting topic and certainly pretty relevant in the world we're living in today.
Absolutely. As we all are kind of living in our world of new normal and really working on preparing education that really allows our learners to thrive in the virtual world, we were finding that research is showing that since the beginning of the pandemic, learners are really spending about 30% more time each month learning. So there's lots of opportunity to really help our teams expand skills to ensure that they're efficient and effective in our new normal. And for us as L&D professionals, we really need to help fill the requirement for this learning. However, although in a recent survey, 42% of the L&D professionals surveyed indicated that learning projects were more of a priority, however, 72% reported that they have decreasing training budgets to accomplish these higher priorities. So today, as we talk about flipping classrooms and working in a virtual environment, although development is a bit different and delivery is obviously quite a bit different, we're finding that we're really able to educate more learners virtually with a lower cost and still provide a very high quality learner experience with excellent knowledge transfer. Since a lot of the learning takes place outside of kind of the virtual classroom environment, it really allows learners to get that baseline experience outside of the classroom and then come into the classroom time to ensure comprehension of the concepts that were discussed in kind of that pre-work and really actually put those concepts to play in virtual classroom activities.
Yeah, Joe, I couldn't agree more. I think, I was reading a study earlier this week where going into 2020, 60+% of training was delivered in person. You flip forward 8-9 months, and we're down to some, 10% of training is delivered in instructor-led training. So flipping the classroom is essential. We can't bring organizations to their knees. You still have to have quality training, whether it be soft skills, technology, leadership, to drive businesses. I mean, we're all still being asked to do so many things that are part of our process that it's essential that we truly, focus on flipping the classroom. So, Jill, I don't know if you want to spend a few minutes just talking about what that means.
Yeah, so when we talk about flipping the classroom, it's not a new concept. It's been around since the early 90s, but it's really taking kind of that information that was previously done in that lecture, the kind of information, and presenting that prior to people getting into a live situation. And that can be done through a lot of different ways. Pre-work from the learner, like there might be forms or worksheets that they need to complete, a lot of e-learning that contains baseline information, so that people are getting that knowledge from a consistency perspective that's throughout the organization and then are able to come into the virtual classroom to apply that. I like to offer students the opportunity to do self-paced activities where you're giving them scenarios and things that they can work through, potentially asking them to meet with a manager to discuss certain topics so that they can then bring that into the classroom discussion when it's time for that. Or even a blended solution where you've got an e-learning that's paired with a self-paced activity. Like an e-learning might take you through kind of the drag, drop, point, click, and then there's a self-paced activity where you're asking them to take the information that they just learned in the e-learning, apply it to an actual scenario that they would have in their daily basis. So once they've done that, then bringing that all of that knowledge into in our case, the virtual classroom in the new world that we're living in now, and getting the opportunity to apply that, either having the virtual instructor and the students dig farther into the concepts, ask very specific questions that they may have identified during their kind of pre-work session. Or also, we have been doing a lot with virtual breakouts. We're giving people the opportunity to work in smaller groups outside of the larger audience and go through scenarios or do some role plays or things like that. And then coming back into the group as a whole and sharing the experiences, talking about what went well, what didn't go well, what can be done to improve that. So from a corporate perspective, it's really taking learning that might have been done, in a 3-hour instructor-led session and breaking it up into really kind of a journey, not just an event.
And Joe, I think, that is best in class. I mean, we know that learning is not about fire hose anymore. I think we still like that concept because we all get in a room, we hurry up, we deliver the content, and then we're hoping that actually gets us to a scenario where we can apply it. In the flipped classroom model, we're taking best practices of learning in general, right? Learning is to be blended. So if you can have a self-paced activity, the virtual classroom, the breakouts, in addition to e-learning or micro-learning, you're really playing into that blended content. The other scenario is, we are seeing more people who are learning and doing more learning today, but we still have a demand for bite-sized content.
Absolutely.
People do not want to be in training for, a full day. They're very focused on short bursts of information that they can process and then internalize. And so in doing, kind of the virtual content, we're able to do that. So we think we've almost been forced because of COVID to kind of stop looking at it as get all the information out there and putting it into concrete steps that are getting us to a higher, faster competency level, and certainly allowing us to, master skills differently. And I don't think that, new normal will turn back to old normal. I think we're going to have a next normal. And that next normal is going to have, lots of those components. Joe, I don't know if you want to spend a few minutes talking about, a customer of ours that chose to do the virtual platform and kind of move down that path before COVID. They had insights and knowledge to know that a sustainable learning program needed to be different.
Yep. So last summer, actually, we had a global client come to us that were going to grow an engineering sales team. And they were really looking to figure out a way to better leverage their SMEs time, really, because previously, every time they would bring on a new sales team member, they would have them spend, days with their one COE person who was kind of the be all end all of the knowledge for that onboarding. And they recognized that if they were going to be bringing on 40, 60, 80 new sales team members, that it was not a sustainable model for the SME alone. So they had come to us and asked to talk about a way that we could turn that program. And originally it was a concept of predominantly e-learning. And as we were digging into more of the content, we recognized that, there were some pretty interesting concepts in there that were probably going to be better off being discussed and worked through in kind of work groups and things like that. So we made a recommendation for a programmatic approach that was a flipped classroom methodology where over the course of, I think it ended up being about 18 to 20 different learning events they went through an entire onboarding program. So it was still kind of, the fire hose mentality that we're giving them a whole lot of information, but it was very much broken up into smaller pieces rather than them coming together for a week together to learn the class from the individual instructor. We started out with a self-paced activity where they would do kind of a self-assessment with themselves to figure out where they were kind of in the scheme of what was needed for the program in itself. And then it started into e-learning, which some had some baseline, and they already had quite a bit of good e-learning from a purely track perspective. So there were quite a few prerequisites that everybody took before they attended the class. But for our specific program, they went through an overview. Then we brought them into a virtual instructor-led training where we had a whole layout of the program itself, where it told them, where each event was going to come in line, what they were going to be doing for each event. We taught them how to use the virtual tool because they hadn't used things like breakout rooms before, or polling before, or doing some of the virtual whiteboarding that we wanted to leverage in the class. So we walked them through kind of using of the tool, gave them an opportunity to practice that. And it was a very short session. It was about 45 minutes of that virtual, but then everybody was level set on what they were going to be looking to do throughout the course of it went over the course of about 3.5 weeks. And then every week we met with them a couple of times, and they did outside of class, they did activities where they might meet with their manager and review their business branch plan. And they would come into the virtual class and talk about that. We did a lot of breakout groups where people would get outside of that and talk about their experience and share that. And then the COE, the SME for the course, who was excellent, very smart, a lot of information to share. He was able to really make things very real for them. So they did, again, the functional information gathering outside of class and really got to apply it within the class. And in the original design, we were going to be doing a day-long capstone where people would travel and come together and kind of do kind of a lot of role plays and things to show how they're applying everything that they had learned through the course of the program to kind of graduate. And our pilot was ironically happening right at COVID lockdown. So we very, very quickly switched that in-person to a virtual session. So a couple of virtual sessions, actually. And I have to say, I feel like it went really well. I attended all of the pilot sessions. We did do some small updates based on things that we had learned during the course of the pilot. They've already taught the class 2 more times since the pilot and are planning for the 4th. So I
think, Jill, having the kind of the insight at that time, no pun intended, has better positioned them. I mean, for onboarding and growth, they made a decision to flip the classroom before flipping the classroom was even something that people were doing. And I think that's important. We are not limited by geography anymore, right? Onboarding is going to change for many organizations. I don't know that we'll have those scenarios where you go to the corporate office. I mean, many of us aren't working in offices at all. You can take a job now in a different geography, which may not have been the case prior. So flipping the classroom allows you to get that hands-on approach without having to sit next to somebody who's going to walk you through how you're going to do your job or what you need to do. It's a different layer of learning. It's a set of activities, to your point. And I think as we move forward, what we're finding is that the virtual classroom, the flipped classroom, is giving us more hands-on. So yes, the training may be longer in duration. So to Jill's point, what was probably a week or so, a couple of days together turned into 3 or 4 weeks of content. However, we were able to get them doing really tactical things. To your point, looking at the business plan, which probably would not have happened, in that instructor-led training where everything is kind of pushed out all at once. And so I do think that onboarding is going to change. The way we're delivering and doing things in that scenario is going to change. And I have, a real world example as well for a customer in an industry that is thriving in COVID. I know we don't hear much about that, but there are those organizations that have truly had to figure out how to meet the demand of what's coming. And part of that is, really focused on things like, doing videos, small snips of, information, building a leadership program that has those same touch points that you're talking about, Jill. So what was once delivered as, a couple hour session with some touch points post is now a multi-week remote solution that is preparing their workforce to become leaders even in a difficult time, because they recognize as managers, they're a retailer. They're not going to be able to have district and regional people go out to deliver that content. So again, flipping the classroom, really making sure there's a set of activities that is, are going to allow people to kind of have that learning, and then they're going to be able to show how they're doing things and kind of test their knowledge before that program is over. So again, I think, COVID has changed the learning and development world. If you don't have a remote or a flipped classroom plan, you certainly have to get there because it's very much the reality. But I definitely think there's something to be said about kind of being forced to get there.
Well, and what I've really enjoyed is seeing how our team has really embraced the opportunity to be uber creative, to really make, kind of that short learning very impactful from an e-learning perspective, just taking a different look at it, how to make it more fun, how to make it more engaging so that people can grab on to that short piece of information and be not only educated by it, but entertained by it. Because, people are taking learning now as they're maybe not waiting for a bus, but maybe getting on an elevator or something, so you need something that's going to grab people's attention and get them really kind of engaged in the concept. And I feel like our team has really jumped into that with both feet and have delivered some pretty impressive things very recently with that, with a lot of use of characters and scripts and, very, very real language being used and that kind of thing that probably might not have been accepted in a corporate learning environment previously.
Right. I think, Jill, it's more about the activities now and how we're applying content more than having, pages and pages of documentation. And so it's really about scripting how you have that knowledge transfer happen, because it's going to happen outside of the classroom versus all the content on the page. And I think the other thing is, we've talking a lot about flipped classroom and learning activities. And we're also seeing, a lot of innovation. We're seeing a lot of organizations take training to the next level. And again, in a pre-COVID world, we talked a lot about virtual reality and AI, and it wasn't necessarily prevalent. And now we're seeing something very different. We're seeing heavy equipment manufacturers and pharmaceutical companies who are taking things like the HoloLens and building virtual content and virtual remote assistants to truly help kind of drive their business. So learning has extended beyond the classroom, right? And is now kind of in that virtual scenario where we're building holograms and working to make sure that we're leveraging all of the technology to keep businesses, moving. And certainly mixed reality has been expedited in COVID-19. It's an extension of that flipped classroom because we're not in a classroom, right? But it's something different. And again, I think, you try to, glass half full, taking lemons, making lemonade. COVID has, I think, taught us to think differently, right? Mm-hmm. We're thinking differently. We're building content differently. And we are seeing incredible results by flipping the classroom. And I think that, as part of the process too of recognizing that we're also working quite a bit remotely. And I know that in creating the content, we're managing completely remote teams, which is very different than what we used to have. We used to have an on-site presence, and now, that's not the case. And I don't know if, Joe, you want to talk a little bit about, meeting with our teams and the customer to kind of build content and kind of manage, that process as well, because that's certainly changed for us since COVID as well.
Well, and absolutely. And kind of before we get into meetings, I think we need to talk about the design of the programs, because I think the way that we're developing learning is a little bit different, because we have to think from an in-person learning perspective. We generally created, a PowerPoint that had some notes in it and maybe a simple handout. Whereas when you're doing kind of the flipped classroom and the virtual learning programs, you really need to think of packaging all of the activity guides and any, scenario guides and everything that people need a little bit more cohesively than I had seen a lot of organizations do in the past. And I know with like that onboarding, the amount of deliverables that we did for that program was very much increased over our kind of normal standard. But in order for the program to run smoothly and efficiently, all of that needed to be packaged. And I think that's another thing from a planning perspective you need to think about, because we had to take people through how to using the tool. So we gave them a cheat sheet on how to use the tool. So all of those things that needed to be there right at point of service were very important. And I think that also applies to meetings as we are going through, because I feel like everything requires additional planning at this point. If you're going to be having a meeting and sharing documents and sharing PowerPoints, you need to think ahead of time. It's not like you're jumping in 2 seconds before the meeting and being totally prepared. And from a virtual perspective, I feel like people have much better calendar integrity. So people are more on time to meetings. So you need to be prepared right at the very beginning, so that you have the PowerPoint ready and shared, so that when people show up in the meeting, you've got the stage set to be done. Make sure that you're really focusing on what's happening in the meeting, because from a virtual perspective, you don't always have the cues that you would have in a live environment. So you need to really be engaged and engage other people. And I have found from both a meetings perspective and from an instructor perspective, people have really taken to calling out and saying, oh, well, what do you think of that, Michele? Because I feel like we really need to really get people involved and active. And I know the meetings that I have been involved in very recently, it's become more and more engaging. I know that at the very beginning of COVID, with people that were just starting to work from home and be virtual, it was a little intimidating to be on calls all day. And I feel like now we've just accepted kind of that new normal, and people have started to get more prepared and planning. And if you're not, you really, really need to make sure that you've got a smooth flow through the meeting or training or whatever virtual activity that you're doing.
And I think, Joe, you're right. I think there's a lot more preparation that's going on in the training world, in the meeting world, and even in managing teams. We all learn in many cases through visuals. It is important to have something on the screen. You can show, facial expressions and be animated to an extent, but I really do think that you have to make sure that you have all of those pieces. And so training, working virtually, managing teams, it takes more planning, and it takes more scenarios like this where you're on camera. Do I love being on camera every day for the balance of the day? No,
nobody does.
Right? And it's something that would have been normal in our process if you were meeting with people all day in a conference room. And so we've just gotten kind of used to that process. It was challenging. And even in a training session, it is very challenging to make sure that people aren't talking over each other if you have large groups. So using the hand raising feature, to Jill's point, calling people out by name. I'll often start a meeting or a training session and say, I may very well call on you, just because I want to make sure that, I am giving you what you need to be successful. And certainly leveraging the tools to the fullest extent. I would say I was probably a novice user of Teams coming out of COVID, or whenever that may be. I use Teams all day, every day. It is kind of a different way of working and a different way of doing things, in my world. So I think the key is it's certainly prep. It is certainly both from a learning and a meeting perspective, having the visuals ready to go, being pointed and focused. Nobody wants to be on a call for 10 hours, right?
Right.
Best practices right now, if it was usually a 1 hour in-person meeting, you should go to 30-40 minutes virtually, because it's all that we can kind of work through, and truthfully there's a lot of distractions, and so we might see some of our journeys going a little bit longer. You may have multiple meetings to come up to a final answer, but ultimately it is manageable, and the verdict is out. I mean, companies are reporting major studies that they're more productive. They're saying that people who used to leave at 4 o'clock will now finish a deliverable till 6 because they don't have the drive time. So things are changing. It's exciting. We have to think about things differently, small chunks of information, and our world has certainly flipped, both in learning and development and, in corporate America.
Exactly. And when we talk about tools, and we use Teams a lot, so I talk to that a lot, but any of the tools, it's important to leverage them and to ensure that people know how to use that. I know within our organization, I do Teams training sessions periodically for our group, just like tips and tricks. Like, there's a new hand raising feature that showed up in Teams a month or so ago. If you hadn't used it, here's how you use it. We talked through that. When we got the new backgrounds, we talked about the new background tools that you have to be able to leverage. Polling. I feel like in training, polling is a fabulous tool because it kind of re-engages everybody, gets them an opportunity to participate without having to, really do tons of work to do that. But not only that, it gives the instructor some good feedback to find out, where you are in that knowledge transfer journey. And if you're using any of the tools, they're all adding new features regularly. So as you are developing your programs, always continue to find what new features are available and leverage those, because they're putting them in because they've got value. I mean, being able to whiteboard in a Teams meeting is fabulous. The hand raising feature, I think, is really good. Again, polling, and we've been using Teams a lot with breakouts too. We had originally started a lot of our programs using GoTo training, but we found that we can do it in Teams as well using breakouts. So that's been able to be leveraged pretty extensively, and it's really easy to jump from room to room for the instructor. So from an ease of use, there's a lot of opportunity there. And like Michele said, we're not going back to old normal. So making sure that we're leveraging the tools that are available to us and planning the use of those appropriately moving forward from a learning perspective is really vital in success.
And I think, Jill, for those of us in the learning and development world, it's exciting times. There's lots of new things to learn. If you'd asked me coming into 2020, would we have learned new tools, new ways? Maybe some, but it has certainly fast-tracked where we're headed, what we're doing. We are so excited to be doing things differently and be able to kind of see the success stories and the case studies that are coming to life, before our eyes. We've had to respond quickly. So from that perspective, I think that there will be lots of new and different things that learning and development professionals are going to produce for our customers as well as the companies that we work for. And I do think it's, exciting times. Last week, many of us at Insight attended our annual technical conference, and it was online. Who would have thought? And well done. So again, with a little preparation, thinking outside of the box, using the technology that you have, a once completely in-person event where people traveled to a physical location was pulled off very well. Yes, different, but still, certainly think that, you can see the results, by doing some of that remotely. So it is exciting times. We're hoping that you're all excited, about what there is on the horizon. And certainly we're hoping to continue to show and tell and talk about how our world is changing, and bring solutions, to our customers and our colleagues about how we can train differently, and certainly ensure competency and ensure that our customers and the companies that we're working for are meeting business goals.
And I think that's a great place for us to wrap it on up. We will be continuing to doing these kind of events moving forward. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you captured some actual feedback from today's session. If your organization is facing hurdles with remote learning and training, we have free resources available to you on insight.com. And if you need more hands-on help, we'll also drop a link into the comments where you can learn more about Insight Service for Learning and Development. Michele and I would love to help you out. Again, thank you so much for joining and have a fabulous day.
Thanks, everybody.